I have the distinct pleasure of introducing my colleague, Krishanti Dharmaraj, the moderator of the second panel towards a post-COVID future, Feminist Perspectives on Care. Krishanti is the executive director of the Center for Women's Global Leadership. She brings 30 years of experience working on women's human rights within the US and internationally. Krishanti is the creator of the Dignity Index, a tool utilized to end identity-based discrimination. Her vision and leadership made San Francisco the first city in the US and globally to pass legislation implementing an international human rights treaty to advance gender equality. Currently, this public policy strategy is being implemented in cities across the United States. She is a member of the governing body of the United Nations Spotlight Initiative, representing civil society globally. Welcome, Krishanti.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Good afternoon and greetings from the land of the Lenape, those indigenous to New Jersey, where the Institute for Women's Leadership and the Center for Women's Global Leadership are housed. Thank you for making time for us, and happy Earth Day to all of you. In July 2020, the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict warned the United Nations Security Council against silencing the voices of those most affected. She said, diverse life experiences must inform policy, operational, and funding decisions. If these are not gender-based in their design, they will be gender-biased and exclusionary in their effect. No words could apply more accurately to recognize that the current pandemic is a gendered crisis, and care work is central, not only to be recognized, but to be integrated into the ways in how we will move forward, including in how the economy would be redefined. When we look at care and the care economy, it is not only gender that we bring into the equation. It includes multiple and intersecting identities such as ethnicity, race, class, caste, sexual orientation and gender identity, religion, ability, immigration status, and more. Unpaid care work is inextricably linked to paid work that is both formal and informal, where predominantly women are multitasking both paid and unpaid work in all sectors, facing heightened levels of discrimination, harassment, violence, and even torture that has resulted in death, even at home. And this pandemic has made home the most dangerous place for women. We are privileged to be joined by three extraordinary women who will examine the future of care. And I am so proud to be a part of this panel along with them. I will start with Catherine Rottenberg. She's the Associate Professor in the Department of American and Canadian Studies at the University of Nottingham. She's also a member of the CARE Collective, a group of 5 activist academics who have co-written the CARE Manifesto. In addition, she is the author of the monographs, The Rise of Neoliberal Feminism and Performing Americanness, Race, Class, and Gender in the Modern African American and Jewish American Literature. Catherine is a longtime social justice activist and is currently active in the UK's University and College Union. Moving on to Melina Labukan Massimo is Lubicon Cree from Northern Alberta. Melina is the founder of Sacred Earth Solar, co-founder and Just Transition leader at Indigenous Climate Action, and a fellow of the David Suzuki Foundation. She's the host of the new TV series called Power in the People and profiles renewable energy in Indigenous communities across the country. Melina holds a master's degree in Indigenous governance from the University of Victoria and with a focus of renewable energy. As a part of her master's thesis, Melina implemented a solar project in her home community of Little Buffalo, which powers the health center in the heart of the tar sands. Our very own Radhika Balakrishnan is a faculty director at the Center for Women's Global Leadership and professor of women and gender and sexuality studies at Rutgers University. She has a PhD in economics from Rutgers. She's a commissioner on the Commission for Gender Equity in New York City. She's on the Global Advisory Council for United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, and the current president for the International Association for Feminist Economists. I will begin with asking the same question from the three panelists. They will each have 7 minutes, and then we will move on to individualized questions. And my request to the virtual audience is please forward your questions via chat to the panelists. We will begin with starting with Melina, then we will move on to Catherine and then Radhika. So my question to the three of you, or rather the first question is, when moving from a pre-COVID-19 careless economy, what strategies do you think should be used to ensure that care is counted? How do you share some of your, and can you share some of your thinking and work in kind of advancing this shift? Thank you.
It is an honor and privilege to be welcomed into this panel. I am calling in from unceded Coast Salish territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam peoples. I introduced myself in my language, which is Nihiau, also known as Cree, and I was born into my small community, which I'll go over a little story. I like telling stories to make these points, but I'm so honored to be here with all of you. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully that works okay in this day and age of COVID and Zoom life. So here we go. So let me know if there's any issues, but so yeah, relearning systems of care. So towards a post-COVID future, an Indigenous perspective, an Indigenous feminist perspective. So again, my name is Melina, and I work and founded both of these organizations with other Indigenous women. And yeah, I wanted to make a point around the careless economy and the fact that the careless economy is connected to colonization and new forms of neocolonialism, where we have destructive, careless economies based on colonial patriarchal values. I'm sure that's no surprise to this audience, but one of the most familiar types of neocolonialism and us in the tar sands are as economic hostages is resource extraction and having no choice but what we are surrounded on. To introduce myself, this is my kuka, my grandmother. I was born into a small community of Little Buffalo. That's actually my dad, who was hidden from the mission schools, the residential schools, till the age of 10, where it was illegal, and you would be jailed if you did not let your children be taken. And so he was hidden with my grandmother and grandfather for about a decade until he went to day school. So they both didn't speak English; they just spoke Cree, my language, and so that's where a lot of my teachings come from. Again, this is where I'm based location-wise here in the earth, at the genesis of the tar sands, which feeds the global addiction and the shared addiction of North Americans, global addiction to oil, the US and in Canada. That comes from our home territory. And this is what it looks like from the air. These are flyovers and biggest trucks in the world. These mines are as big as entire size of cities. So as you can see, a very careless economy. Imperial Oil, for instance, is as big as Washington, D.C. alone, just one mine. There's several mines and 100 different operations. Massive oil spills. I encourage you to look on Oil on the Buchan Land on YouTube, and it will talk more about this massive spill beside my home community where we had to breathe contaminated air, very much a toxic burden that we are experiencing. Cultural genocide and environmental genocide, encroachment and contamination and destruction of our traditional territories, resulting in loss of cultural traditions and places and spaces to practice our ceremony and customs. And this is what the landscape is being replaced by: drained and polluted air and contaminated water, a very toxic burden that our families take on for the ability for people to drive cars and do all the things that we do with oil. And the impact is on what we're talking about today, the cultures of care. And I want to talk about the culture of care in terms of, from an Indigenous perspective, because this is all over North America. This is not just one, it's a microcosm of a macrocosm of what we call Turtle Island as Indigenous peoples of North America. It impacts many communities, Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies, fence line communities, cancer clusters, and all of the different associated impacts of being, experiencing environmental racism. I also wanted to bring this point in of violence against the earth begets violence against women, and the colonial values of patriarchy and capitalism, which exploit land and exploit women. This is very closely connected to the murdered and missing Indigenous women's epidemic across North America, with thousands and thousands of murdered and missing women, including my sister Bella, who was found dead after she graduated from college in Toronto. So it is no coincidence that our women are dying and the land is dying. This is my beautiful sister Bella, one of the thousands and thousands of murdered and missing Indigenous women that's happening across Turtle Island, so-called North America. So that brings me to what a just recovery looks like. We signed on as our organizations to the 6 principles for a just recovery. The 6th being right here, putting people's health and well-being first, strengthening social safety nets and providing relief directly to people, recognizing the needs of workers and communities, building resilience to prevent future crises, which is very much connected to the climate crises, and building solidarity and equity across communities, generations, and borders. And then the last one I will talk more specifically on as an Indigenous panelist on this panel is upholding Indigenous rights and working in partnership with Indigenous peoples. And that obviously connects to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which talks about free, prior, and informed consent, which is not being upheld by the countries that have signed on to this declaration, and continually see a violation of Indigenous human rights across the world in North America. And we just saw another murder of an Indigenous land defender yesterday in Colombia. So this is definitely not happening. So I wanted to bring that international law to this conversation and talk about the critical paradigm shift that we need to have and that needs to happen. Indigenous peoples have a very intimate and reciprocal relationship with Mother Earth. And with that relationship, we have a sacred responsibility to protect her. And so that's why you see so many Indigenous land defenders across the globe, across Turtle Island, protecting her, standing up, being arrested, blocking themselves, chaining themselves, all of the things. Or you see us in, shifting policy. You see us, I've joined many policy tables on climate throughout the years. So there's a variety of different ways Indigenous peoples are doing this work. But because the Indigenous worldview is that all life is sacred, when we're in ceremony, we say, when we end and start, we say, all my relationship is that, in that, all my relations, in that sacred understanding of all life, all connection to all beings. And so I wanted to bring these other points of Indigenous governance, actually having collective care structures in place pre-contact and now. And that's very unseen, very invisibilized in North America, because the Indigenous issue is very invisibilized across this continent, unfortunately. And so, I wanted to bring that in because we have always functioned as collectives through shared decision-making processes, structures. We did have matriarchal systems as opposed to the patriarchal system of dominance that exists currently, which has put our earth so much out of shift, and our society so much out of balance, and we needing that shift. So we are out of balance at this point in time. And so Indigenous peoples have always also had systems of care in place, as well as the collective healing. So we have collective healing, not just self-liberation, but collective liberation, accountability processes, and also the system of distribution of wealth. And that comes in potlatch systems, redistribution of wealth through we call giveaways. So there was these types of systems of care already in place and are still in place within our governance structures. A lot of times it's not recognized by the colonial state, but they are functioning within our communities. And I speak to that as a daughter of a chief who, is in and runs that way. So So I'm going to talk really quickly in closing around empowering women in community-based solutions and what returning to zero waste communities are, which is our community's way of always being. And so building these solar projects, putting them up. This is Carlton, who we trained to put up the solar project in our community, which powers our health center. And we had a solar feast, a solar launch, a ribbon cutting ceremony, and bringing in workshops, climate literacy, energy literacy workshops to avoid future pandemics like we are in right now, and building Sacred or Solar and allowing Indigenous women to take their place as inherent land protectors, water protectors, and powering them up with solar technologies, because that is the way we stand firm on our territories, is to assert the jurisdiction and the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples who always have been caretakers of North America. It is no coincidence that North America was in pristine, beautiful condition because Indigenous peoples were intimately connected and caretaking on that level. And that's what we need to bring back to systems of care. And so that's what I have to say. Also, here's Power to the People. Feel free to watch it. And here's a way to get more information about Sacred or Solar and Indigenous climate action. And I will pass it back. And so thank you so much for having me today on this panel.
Thank you very much, Melina. We are on to Catherine.
Oh, but good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? There's a little bit of an echo. It's such an honor to be here. And thank you so much, Melina, for that very moving presentation. And in the next few minutes, what I would like to do is to briefly take up this notion of a careless economy. Since in the work that I do, that I've carried out with the Care Collective, and I'll say a few words about the collective in a minute, we speak not only about a careless economy, but a reign and politics of carelessness. And this reign of carelessness has gotten us to our current devastating precipice. I'd also like to share with you the way in which the Care Collective has tried to imagine a different world, one that mobilizes this moment of global rupture to reorganize our lives, not around carelessness, but care. So one of the strategies that the Care Collective thinks is crucial moving forward into a post-COVID world is precisely imagining together and offering progressive alternative narratives of and for the future. So until really recently, we had become really accustomed to dystopic visions, and the Care Collective's collaboratively authored Care Manifesto endeavors to offer a more utopian one, what we call a feminist, queer, anti-racist, and eco-socialist vision. So just a very few brief words about the Care Collective. Does everybody hear the echo, or is that just me? No? Okay. So it was created as a reading group in 2017. We were just a bunch of academics who were also activists in various social justice movements. And we wanted to come together to try to make sense of what we saw as the multiple crises of care already engulfing our world. The rising inequality everywhere, the refugee crisis and looming over everything, ongoing climate change and environmental catastrophe. So after meeting for almost 2 years, reading, discussing, debating, and often disagreeing, we decided to write a manifesto, what would become the Care Manifesto the politics of interdependence. Of course, when we began writing in 2019, we could never have anticipated how grimly urgent COVID would make our manifesto. Keep hearing the echo. So in our manifesto, we argue that the current global crisis in which we find ourselves is indeed primarily a crisis of care. It's the result of histories and continued legacies of colonial, imperialist, misogynist, and white supremacist violence, compounded by now decades of intensified neoliberal policies prioritizing profit over people. And we argue that if the pandemic has taught us anything so far, and let's hope it has, it is that we are in urgent need of a radically new politics that puts care front and center of life. And we have a few premises that undergird our vision. One is that building a caring world begins first and foremost by recognizing that our survival and our thriving are everywhere and always contingent on others. Creating caring alternatives, in other words, involves avowing our mutual interdependencies and addressing the inevitable ambivalences at the heart of care and caregiving. And another key premise is that only by ensuring that communities have ample resources, infrastructure, and time can we create the conditions that render a caring disposition toward the other, however distant, ever more possible. So drawing on past examples and present manifestations of caring possibilities, Standing Rock and COVID mutual aid organizations come to mind here, as well as drawing on scholars, activists, and movements such as Black Lives Matter. The Care Manifesto understands care as being necessary across every distinct scale of life. And so when we started, it was an intellectual exercise. We asked ourselves, what would the world look like? What would the world look like if the organizing principle were care? So in an effort to conjure up this world, we decided to look at different scales, from the planetary through the economy, to the state, to communities, and to our intimate kinship structures. We begin the manifesto by diagnosing the interconnected nature of the current reign of carelessness. We travel then from the global dimensions that have produced the climate crisis and economies that put profit over people, traveling through to careless states, economies, and communities, to how the banality of carelessness affects our interpersonal intimacies. But then we travel outward, scaling up from the interpersonal to the planetary in order to outline caring alternatives to our contemporary condition of carelessness. And we use this structure because we want to show how our capacities to care are independent and can only be cultivated and realized by avowing these inextricable interconnections. So in a nutshell, beginning with the most intimate aspects of our lives, our vision translates into reimagining the limits of familial care to embrace more promiscuous models of kinship, multiplying who we care for and how. It translates into reclaiming forms of genuinely collective and communal life, where caring communities are able to prioritize the commons, to create collective public spaces, and to encourage a sharing infrastructure. It means expanding democratic participation and adopting alternative to capitalist markets. It means insourcing wealth, reversing the marketization of care infrastructures. And it means restoring, invigorating, and radically deepening many aspects of our welfare states, ridding them of all racialized policies and the sexual and racial division of labor. But creating caring states will require not only recognition of past atrocities, but also a reckoning with and multiple forms of reparation for genocide, slavery, and dispossession. It's only by confronting the past and prioritizing the needs those who have been most marginalized, violated, and negated by uncaring nation states will be able to move forward into a juster future and cultivate a radically different way of relating to others and the world itself. And finally, creating a caring world translates into mobilizing and cultivating a transnational orientation of care towards the stranger, creating porous borders and Green New Deals on the transnational level. So in this way, the Care Manifesto develops a notion of universal care, which calls for inventive forms of collective care at every single scale of life, where interdependence is avowed. So the vision that we offer is one where care is understood as our individual and common ability to provide the political, the social, material, and emotional conditions that allow for the greatest possible number of people and living creatures on this planet, along with the planet itself, to thrive. And I'm sorry if I have this weird echo in my ear. I kept hearing myself at a delay.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Radhika, on to you now.
Thank you so much. In terms of my intervention, I'm going to put my time clock on just so that I stick to my 7 minutes. I think the first thing I want to say is that one of the real important aspects of this COVID crisis is that it exposed the level of inequality that already existed in our society. And it kind of got put on television, right? I mean, suddenly we were watching people standing in food lines and everyone was sent home. And the entire role of care in terms of the healthcare industry has been spoken about quite a bit, but it was not only a crisis of health, which COVID is, it was a crisis of care, both paid and unpaid care, and a crisis of the economy. And all of those happened simultaneously. And too often people keep saying, well, we're going to build back better. But I think, as both of you have already said, the back was never good. So we don't need to build back, we need to build forward to a new kind of economy. And really, this economic crisis is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this. It's a supply crisis, it's a demand crisis, it's a healthcare crisis, and it's simultaneously happening all over the world. And most of the conversation today in the last panel and here has been looking at it in terms of a particular location, but it's also a global phenomenon that we need to address, because if you do, I mean, the idea of contagion, right? This is a disease that there's contagion. And so if you don't deal with it at a global level, you're not going to be able to. So I'll focus today, because the last panel really talked about the care workers. I'll focus a little bit more on the unpaid care work and what the non-market unpaid care work and what this crisis did in terms of exposing and really pushing for a need to understand it, which has always been there, right? And I think Pinar Ilkarachan in the panel this morning or whatever it was, I watched it yesterday, but talked about the value of unpaid care work, right? It's $11 trillion if we were going to pay for that care work, or 9 to 10% of global GDP. So as feminist economists, one of the things that we've been doing for a very long time is to say, look, you have to rethink what the economy means, right? It's not just the marketized, monetized version, which when people talk about the economy, they always only talk about the monetized, but what does the unpaid, non-market economy do in order to sustain the economy? Because if you didn't have that unpaid, you wouldn't have the economy, right? So we've been trying to sort of do this work for a long time. And I think the COVID crisis kind of brought it all to attention in some ways. But in terms of employment, and this is just in the US, and I don't know the numbers globally, but because everyone went home, and who does the unpaid work at home? Still predominantly women. The percentage of women who've left the paid labor force has been huge. The number of the actual number, I don't remember, but it's 1987 levels. It's the worst labor force participation rates for women in 37 years, right? In the US. That just shrunk in the last year and a half. So then when you're coming home, so you have a choice between entering paid work versus unpaid work. What are you going to choose? And most women, I think in the last panel talked about, don't have the choice. What are they going to do with their children when the schools are shut and they have to go to work? And so if we're going to have a caring economy, what are the kind of things that we need to look at? We need to look at macroeconomic policy, which is something that we haven't talked about enough. You know, in the US, there was just this $1.9 trillion big, huge thing. How much of that is going into investment in care? Because as you invest in care services, it actually not only employs people in those services, but it also gives other women who can leave their children in care, go and reach employment. So we need to look at macroeconomic policies. We need to look at tax policy, right? So much of this expenditure, the kind of deficit hawks are going to come very soon and say, oh, we can't spend this much money because it's going to cause a thing. But no one said that when we gave tax cuts of the same amount. So a feminist response is also a response to addressing tax. Tax is a feminist issue. We need to look at social protection programs. And I think we talked about it a little bit in the last panel. What are the kind of social protection programs? How many undocumented women have access to social protection programs? How many informal sector workers, and globally that's where a lot of women work, how many informal sector workers will be able to access those kind of social protection programs? So we need to rethink global social protection programs. We also need to think about global inequalities between nations, right? So the US can say, I'm going to spend $1.9 trillion on this, and you know, how many ever trillions on something else in the military. Most countries can't make that decision on their own. They have to go to institutions like the International Monetary Fund and say, oh, please give me some money because I have. And already there was a study that just came out a couple of days ago that said that over 150 countries are going into serious austerity coming this year, at a time in which what you need is huge levels of spending. They're going back to an old notion of neoliberal economic policy based on sort of balance of payments crisis and saying, no, you all need to shrink your economy, when what you need is increased expenditure on health, you need on care. So a caring economy is one in which we change what the economy stands for. What does it mean to have an economy? We all participate in it. I'm working on a project right now that's called What's the Economy For? And what if we say that what the economy is for is to fulfill rights, like the right to health, the right gender equality, the rights of Indigenous people, the right to land, all of these things, and we put that in the forefront of what the economy is for, we would come up with a very different notion of the economy. And the other thing that I want to say, I'm just looking at the time, is that we've been living in, and I think you mentioned, you know, the neoliberal state. The neoliberal state has said the state's not, we don't like the state. They're not supposed to do the social welfare part of their job. They're very good at doing the disciplining part of their job, but that one's never stopped. But the social welfare part of their job has never really been questioned. And it's been shrunk and shrunk, and suddenly COVID hit. Who's supposed to save us? The state, right? But who is accountable? Who's holding that state accountable? And how do we hold the state accountable to feminist values? Because I think that's where we need to go forward in terms of policy, is holding the state accountable to feminist values and holding the global infrastructure. Because I think we can no longer talk about nations isolated. We have to talk about global, right? And so what kind of feminist voice do we want to bring to multilateralism, and other things. I went over time. I'm sorry. Sorry, Krishanti. I get excited about these things.
Thank you. I would have listened to you for longer, but we have limited time. So I want actually, if you can, to expand in our next section where we will have, kind of individualized questions. So thanks, Radhika, and thank you to all three of you. I want to go back to Melina. And Melina, you spoke to this already. We in the Americas are on indigenous land, currently occupied land, right? Where issues of and the rights of indigenous peoples are often invisible. And I think it's purposefully, and I think most would agree with that, right? Do you think now in this post-COVID era that things would change and that we would actually hear about the issues and the rights of indigenous people, most importantly about your governance? Thank you. And you have about 5 minutes to respond.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it is definitely by design that Indigenous issues are left out of the dialogue and our discourse for a good reason, because it allows white supremacy to reign, and it allows the ability for government states to have authority on land that is actually not under their jurisdiction. It's actually still under, and should be under, Indigenous jurisdiction as the original stewards of the land, and actually the caretakers that actually know how to manage the land. We see massive forest fires happening out west because of the inability to manage the fire, the natural burnings that happened across North America to avoid massive forest fires. There was a lot of Indigenous management. And so that's slowly coming back. There's some co-management that's happening up here in so-called Canada, north of the Medicine Line. I don't know how much in the United States so much, because I feel like in so-called Canada, there is an acknowledgement more and more now of Indigenous territories, and that's great. I think sometimes it can be lip service, but it's also, people coming back to understanding their own history. It's not just Indigenous history, it is the history of all peoples that make their homes on American soil and Canadian so-called soil. And I think that's such an important thing. And I think it will only happen though when other people, I myself have been doing community organizing and awareness raising, advocacy work for 20 years, and I can do as much as I can, but it also, the responsibility is also on all people's shoulders. It's not just on Indigenous people's shoulders to teach the history of America and Canada to American and Canadians, because a lot of us don't even actually identify as Canadian or American. We identify as Indigenous because our nation states predate the two colonial states where we live on now. And I wanted to make, another point around frontline land protection, around unpaid work, because I think, we think of frontline land protectors. So, we see Standing Rock right now, Line 3. There's been a 3-year occupation against the Line 3 tar sands mega pipeline. There's been an occupations of Indigenous peoples on their territory, asserting jurisdiction, and this predominantly is unpaid work, and this unpaid work or vastly undercompensated. And this unpaid work actually allows us all on planet Earth to stay well, and allows us to avert more catastrophic climate change. It also allows us to hopefully avert more pandemics in the future. And it's so interesting that it's, that this also isn't taken into consideration, when we're coming up against this incredibly traumatizing work, that when people are putting Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples are putting their bodies over and over again on the front lines in direct conflict with the state, police, corporations, and colonial states that have, exorbitant amounts of resources, where we're completely under-resourced, but yet we're still making that impact, where you still see Standing Rock becoming an international phenomenon of people around the world coming to stand with the Lakota, Dakota peoples in their territories. And I think that, signal the change, that people are, no longer relegating this issue to, oh, that's just an Indigenous people's issue. No, it's a human issue. It's a human being issue. And I think that's what's so important. Yeah, so I think I have hope that it changes. Some days I don't have so much hope, but some days I do have hope. It depends on what day you talk to me. But yeah, thank you for that question, and I'll pass it back to you, Krishanti.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And Catherine, given the reign of careless economies in contemporary states, nation states, can you give more details about the CARE Manifesto in how it could be operationalized?
Hard to imagine at this point in history, but basically what we try to do in the CARE Manifesto, I mean, it really is a manifesto. It's a polemic, it's a utopic vision of a future world. And what we do is we outline what a state could look like if it were organized around care. And actually we separate the economy, interestingly enough, into a different scale, because the economy, it penetrates, or that's infiltrates, or is part of all the different scales. You can't extricate the economy from any of these. But in any case, the caring state begins with the idea that we need to change our notions or transform our notions of belonging. So a state can only be caring if notions of belonging are based on recognition of mutual interdependencies rather than on ethno-cultural identity and racialized border. So that's the beginning. A caring state is one in which the provision for all of our basic needs are taken care of, and a sharing infrastructure is ensured, while at the same time participatory democracy is deepened at every level and the health of the environment is prioritized. So of course, this means turning the current priorities of the state on its head, on their head, as well as renewing, as well as transforming models of welfare and social provision. And we had a lot of discussions about whether the idea of the welfare state was adequate for a caring state. And what we in the CARE Collective all ultimately came to consensus about was that public provision has to be based on what disability activists call strategic autonomy and independence, which is premised upon everyone receiving what they need to thrive, but also with some sense of agency in the world. So we also believe that while the state is necessary at this point in history to ensure the smooth provision of services and resources, it also has to be responsible for facilitating greater democratic engagement among communities. So, I mean, in terms of what a caring state might actually look like, would mean safeguarding affordable housing, along with high quality public schooling, public university education, and vocational training. And I would even, say add universal basic income and services. But I just read a really interesting article where they talk about universal shared services rather than basic services, which I like. So in the CARE Collective, we basically argue that by prioritizing a care-based infrastructure based upon recognition of our interdependencies and vulnerabilities, while ensuring all the necessary conditions for the mutual thriving of all, a caring state undermines basically the conditions that produce economic, environmental refugees and migrants. And so there's also some recognition. I mean, there is recognition. It's so hard for me with this echo because I hear myself and then there's a delay. That no state or even any community can ever completely eliminate human aggression, relations of domination, or natural and human-made disasters. But what we were really trying to think about are what are the kinds of conditions that would enable the vast majority of people living within the domains of this caring state to flourish. So that's the ways that we began outlining a template without being too prescriptive, we hope.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. We touched on this, Radhika, a little bit when we were talking about inequality and how, COVID has really amplified it. And I want you to know if you could elaborate further on how structural gender-based discrimination contributes to this discussion on care, and also the increase of violence against women that we see.
I mean, the systemic inequalities that have existed are due to systemic discrimination and certain kinds of gender roles, and we can go back in history and talk about colonial constructions of those, but not just gender, but race, ethnicity, disability, and all of those are at play. And so I thought, to answer that question, Krishanti, I thought let's just take a couple scenarios and then see what comes out of those, right? So the COVID crisis happens, people are sent home, suddenly everyone's inside the house. Maybe one or two of the people who were earning money are earning less money. There's less household income, and you can't leave, right? You can't leave. And in those instances, and the data is there, the increase in gender-based violence in the home just skyrocketed all over the world, right? So what happened? Was it because suddenly everyone got violent, or were there systemic inequalities within the household and power dimensions that existed that this compounded? You couldn't leave the house. Maybe you lost your job. You don't have money to go out. Domestic violence centers are shut. Governments are not increasing spending on those centers or giving ways for mostly women to access resources to be able to go there. And it's not only during COVID. I mean, I remember after the 2008 financial crisis, I was traveling in Spain, and one of the places that the budget cuts were in funding domestic violence centers. And so women had lost their jobs, they were sitting at home, they're in a violent situation, there's no childcare center where they could leave their kids and go and get help. So, those are all existing inequalities that are systemic. And then what this does is compounds what happens to that. And then within that, access to any kind of services depends on where you are located in the economy. Right? So do you have access to services if you are an undocumented worker in the US? And I'm thinking also globally, the informal sector workers, where do they go? I mean, I'm sure all of you have seen the crazy videos of the migrant workers in India having to leave cities and go back. That's based on inequalities of those people in those situations, right? It's just, I think what COVID did in some ways was it televised what was already there. And somehow everyone started paying attention. It's like, okay, millions of migrant workers, well, where did they sleep before? I don't think most people even thought about that. And then what is the level of violence that they're dealing with as they're moving? What kind of protection? They were sleeping on the streets. Where do women be safe when they're sleeping on the streets? So the question is that, is it based on systemic discrimination and power and inequality that already existed? Absolutely. And what this did is compound it. And now, moving forward, how do we recognize this, and what are the kind of policies we need to put into place in order for us to deal with these kind of issues? You talked about the violence of, and in Indigenous communities and the murder of so many Indigenous women. Your sister, I'm very sorry to hear it. How do we take that information? That's based on systemic discrimination, inequality, power dynamic. We all know it. but I think what we need to do is to really come together and envision what kind of world we want to move forward with. And if there was ever, I keep saying this, if there was ever a time, at least in my lifetime, that we need a new vision, it's now. And I think it has to be a feminist vision. I don't think it can be anything but a feminist vision.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm waiting for some questions to come through. In the meantime, I want to go back to you, Melina. In a way, when you started speaking, you kind of turned the question of like the term care, I think, the other way around, because when you started talking about land, right? And how, in that case, how the Indigenous community really thinks about care perhaps is different. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting too, because at the beginning of, I put a feminist perspective, and they're actually synonymous. So a lot of times Indigenous peoples don't call ourselves even feminists, because Indigenous governance systems and structures and connection to land and the way that we see the earth is we call her Mother Earth. And so there's this sacred feminine connection in this. And so why I talked about the needing for a paradigm shift is bringing back that rebalance and those ancient views, ancient wisdom traditions that existed, not only here as Indigenous people in North America, but, across the world. And so I think that is that rebalancing that we're coming back into the sacred feminine and that connection to land as our Earth Mother, and the fact that we are a part of her. And I think the thing with patriarchy and, this careless economy of capitalism and neocolonialism and neoliberalism is that we are on this pinnacle of just like this hierarchy that exists in this world where we see humans somehow at the top, which is so just like such a foreign concept for Indigenous peoples that see the sacred hoop and us being a part of the sacred view of being one of the many of living beings that coexist here on planet Earth, and we are not the dominant, and nor should we be the dominant structure and force of the world. So that is that inclusion and that rebalancing and sacred view of coming back into harmony with Mother Earth. And Indigenous peoples have always had that. So we that's why you see us on the front lines. That's why you see us raising the alarm bell for climate and all of the things with with other climate scientists. But I talk more publicly now about sacred view to show and hope and invite other people from other ancient traditions that maybe have been severed from them to reconnect with those natural laws and those truths that we really do exist under natural law, not under some human propagated, human-made economy that's such a falsity. We need to return to natural law to be able to live in coexistence and caretaking of her.
Thank you. Radhika, I want to go to you next. There's a question that in the chat. What would or could a macroeconomic and fiscal policy look like in a caring state?
Yeah. I will answer that, but I want to just jump for a second to piggyback on Melina's comment. Is that okay?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm all excited about this because, one of the things in economics is the judging of an economy is based on GDP growth, right? Which the relationship between growth and the natural environment, we all know, it's called climate change, right? And so there's a whole bunch of new thinking on making well-being the way in which you generate an idea of the economy. New Zealand, many other countries are trying to look at this well-being, and the OECD actually has a whole bunch of indicators on how to judge an economy by well-being. Well, one of them that I've been working on is in Ecuador and Bolivia. They're taking the idea of well-being and calling it buen vivir, which is the good life, but translated in Spanish as good life, but I think it's from Quechua that means something much bigger, which is the good life for the planet. right? And that it doesn't make the person in charge of the planet. And so there's just some really interesting things on Buen Vivir, and anyway, there's some criticism about it as well, but I've just been thinking about it. So when I heard you speak, I was just like, wow, we need to get together and talk some more. In terms of what are the kind of macroeconomic policies that we need to look at? We need to look at macroeconomic policy in terms of its relationship both to the market work and the non-market unpaid work. And I'll give you just a very basic example. So I just talked about the level of austerity that's going to take place around the world, where people can't borrow the money that they can. Well, when austerity hits and you start cutting education, healthcare, all the kind of things that austerity programs cut, who takes up that burden, right? When your school programs are closed and the kids are coming home, who takes care of them, right? If someone is sick and there's no healthcare provision, it's the assumption that basically women's unpaid work is just infinitely elastic, So we actually end up taking the burden of macroeconomic policy. So when there is what I would say is that one of the things that we need to look at is spending policy. You have to increase spending policy, and we need to increase spending policy that looks at care, right? I mean, that looks at when we talk about infrastructure, care is an infrastructure, right? It's not something you waste. It's something that you build. By building in a caring economy, you're actually building new ways of living. The UK Women's Budget Group, and I want to plug this, is they've come up with this great, a caring economy. It's not a manifesto, but more like a government policy prescription that they actually say, what are the macroeconomic policies that we need? And Ipek Karachin, who spoke on the panel earlier on, and she's built on that work of the caring economy, and she's included the environment and saying, how do we take the destruction of the environment into the way we look at economic policy, what she calls the purple economy? And how do we, in the same way you talk about green economy, how do we put green and care and feminist together? And she's coined this term, the purple economy. So I think looking at macroeconomic policy from the caring side gives you a very prescriptive sense of what kind of, tax policy. We need to tax like crazy amount of tax so the people who are polluting. And, I mean, what? 5 people made more money during this COVID crisis than they ever did before. I mean, that's unconscionable. I mean, that's ridiculous when people are standing on food stamps. So we need to have a redistributive economy. We need a different tax structure. We've had 30 years of neoliberal economic policy and 20 years of financialization. Well, it's got to stop because it's not working. It's not working. And at some point, what island are they all going to live in? With their Maseratis. They can't all live on this one island where they're going to have to interact with the rest of us at some point.
Thank you very much. I have so many more questions on that, but I am now going to Catherine. So the question is like, this is a stimulating conversation, and this is a reminder of the need to change our education systems and curricula. Can you speak to some examples of how this is happening, or this could happen?
So it's really interesting that the question is around education, because it's one of the things that in the manifesto that we actually didn't go into much detail, but it's one of the things that I've been very involved in here in the UK. And I don't know what's happening quite so well in the US at the moment, but I know that in the UK, the education system is in crisis, and that's particularly true of the higher education sector, and that what we're seeing is not only the neoliberalization, but also this managerial, bureaucratic apparatus, which is destroying not only academics, freedom of speech, but also any sense of education as kind of an intellectual, curious critical thinking. I mean, so I think one of the things that we're fighting for within the union in the UK is to change governance structures. I mean, we're not even trying to deal with the government bailing out the universities, because with the Tory government, that's not going to happen. But we're trying to work within these institutions and transform them from within. And that begins with democratic governance within these institutions. And of course, thinking about curriculum, we need completely transformed curriculum, which is not only decolonized, but also is actually encouraging critical thinking, good reading skills, good writing skills, however we define those at a particular moment in time. But also, of course, we need to completely rebuild public education from the ground, from nursery, free, high quality nursery, from zero to secondary and higher education. I mean, that's the beginning, where you have the resource and you have democratic governance, and yeah, and that is going to be an uphill battle, especially here in the UK. You're on mute, Krishanti.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So thank you very much for the round of questions that you've gotten. I have one question that I want like a 1-minute answer on from the three of you. And that is in relation to women's leadership. So there's much conversation about women's leadership, the formal leadership that is structured within a patriarchal and a colonial frame. How do you think women should exercise leadership to shift the discourse on care? Is there a difference, and what are your thoughts? And a quick round of 1 minute each. Thank you.
Who do you want to go first?
Sorry, I'll start with you, Radhika.
Okay. I would say, I actually would not say women's leadership. I would say feminist leadership, because I grew up in India with Mrs. Gandhi as the prime minister. And so I think just having a woman doesn't, it's got to be feminist leadership. And so I think feminist leadership is really critical. And we see when we do have feminist leadership, and what difference it makes. And it kind of piggybacks on the question that Lisa asked about education, and this is me personally. How many economics departments have feminist economists? I can tell you in the US it's 3, so we need to talk about sort of how do we get feminists in disciplines to teach, so that there's a whole change in the structure of thinking, so that you're not sort of this outlier, which is what we are. And most of us are not in economics departments. I mean, that's my own pet peeve, but I would change it from women's leadership to feminist leadership. Thank
you. Catherine?
I completely agree with Radhika. I do think that fortunately or unfortunately, often feminist leadership and women's leadership are intimately connected. And I also think that one of the things that I've learned through my social justice activism is that whatever kind of leadership, feminist, women, it needs to be collaborative and coalitional. And that's how we are best able to move forward.
Thank you. And Malina?
Sure. For me, I think in this conversation, a culture of care, so it is uplifting women in all of their respective works. I think there's an underlying insidious patriarchal value that often takes over women's leadership that does undermine other ways of collaboration, like Catherine said. And I think we need to really look at ways of healing as well from patriarchy, and also healing Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies, and making that a priority too, of a culture of care. What does healing justice look like in this work as well, of healing from white body supremacy? And I really want to lift up like Resmaa Menakem, who I think is just such an amazing Black clinical scholar and therapist who talks a lot about how racialized trauma is a huge thing that we need to address in our society. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, we gave you a curated set of questions, and I want to just open up and just let the three of you speak on anything that you want for the audience to know, either about your work or about a comment in relation to care. Starting with you, Radhika.
Wow, I wasn't expecting that, so I didn't quite have my head together. Just anything. I mean, I think the issue of care. I think yeah, this is what I'll say. I think everyone is sort of jumping on this thing of care, and one of the things that I worry about is that then the way in which care is understood is at its minimal, you know, and so there's a whole bunch of foundations coming together who want to fund care. And so then they're going to give money. I mean, and I think this is money that should go to domestic workers, organizing, unionized, you know, healthcare workers, increasing all of that, all good things to do. But that isn't going to end gender inequality, right? I mean, and I worry about that. I worry that it becomes sort of at the micro level, that if we deal with care workers and give care infrastructure, then we'll have gender equality, and not look at the kind of economic, macroeconomic issues, the issues that you brought up, that you know is at the root of capitalism. And obviously, I'm not asking donors to undermine capitalism. They wouldn't exist if they didn't have it. But I think we need to be careful when everyone is jumping on this idea of care, that it doesn't become brought down to its lowest denominator, right? I mean, yes, care workers should get a lot more money. They should be unionized. All of that, I agree. But that's just one aspect of what is wrong with power and inequality in our society. And I worry that, as I see, I mean, as someone who's been talking and writing about care for 25 years, it's exciting that now everybody wants to, you know, feminist economists are the cachet right now. But I don't want to see it get diminished to making sure that care work, that it's not only about care workers, but that it's the overall structure that we need to really re-envision. And how do we re-envision that from a feminist perspective?
Thank you. I think what you're really asking funders, as well as all of us, to do is to really look at the root causes and structural change. And I think there is a way in which funders look at return on investment differently. So I think that is a challenge that you have really opened up. Catherine, going to you.
So I absolutely agree. And one of the things that we tried to do in the manifesto is precisely move discourses of care away from not only hands-on care, but thinking about care as an organizing principle, and how that organizing principle would operate at different scales. And it looks different. And so the kind of definition that we open up in terms of universal care, we don't close it down, is one that tries to think creatively of what care would look like, from the interpersonal to the planetary. But I also want to say that care is in the air. And I think that that's both an opportunity, but also it could be a trap, in the sense that it becomes bad. It becomes what we call in the care manifesto, care washing. So corporations jump on and they say that they care. And I think one of the things that we would posit as a care collective is that, in contrast to calls for liberation in the 60s and the 70s, care has become the key problematic for politics today, and not just for politics, but for economists. and for social justice activists.
Thanks. And on to you, Melina.
Sure. For me, I guess what I would like to say to close is, yeah, we were talking about going at the root causes of the issues that we're talking about today. So for me, that's actually the decolonizations of our minds, bodies, and our spirits. And so that's, for me, what I see is, we see this like self-care movement, which is definitely individualized again and corporatized and capitalized through this like thing of like, I'm going to meditate and be in a room by myself. And so therefore that's how somebody is changing the world. And that's not, we know that self-care is connected intimately to collective liberation, collective care. And so I think it needs to go away from the individual to the collective. And that's why for Indigenous peoples, that's what we call decolonizing. And so for me, that's a big thing to take into consideration, that I invite everyone here today to decolonize to the best of your ability. As people, as settlers on stolen land, and understand what that means and what that is. And yeah, I also put in the chat here, please, for more resources around Indigenous sovereignty and how to support that, go to Sacred Earth Solar, go to indigenousclimateaction.com or powertothepeople.tv, and you can learn more about these things that I was talking about today. So hi, thank you so much for having me in this conversation. It's an honor to be on the panel with all of you amazing women.
Thank you to the three of you. You've been amazing, and this conversation has really enriched the continued conversations on care and how to think about it and how to reevaluate and what moving forward might look like. In closing, I just wanted to kind of really thank the three of you again for being here, for your time, for your thinking, and for your passion, and what you do on a daily basis. We know that until women are valued as human, the women's labor will not be valued as full and equal contributions to an economy or to this world in the current context. There will be no building back better or building differently and really moving forward unless women's experiences within their multiple and intersecting identities are recognized and integrated into social, political, economic, and cultural spheres that we aim to influence. The new and improved normal is not only about kind of building back better and really thinking about care in the current way we have been engaging, but it is also about living better in harmony with the environment. And for this, women's work has to be valued. It has to be integrated, and our contributions should be recognized as partly, as massively as possible, as it's fundamental to the well-being and the sustainability of people and the planet.